Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Jill Brown, Director of Public Programs at Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Finding a Needle in a Haystack, the Auschwitz Album. Before we get started, I want to mention that the museum recently changed our name. We said goodbye to Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust and LA MOT and started a new era as Holocaust Museum LA. While we continue our founder's mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire, we hope to reach a wider audience with our more contemporary name and logo. I encourage you to visit our new website at holocaustmuseumla.org. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mitch Kreitenberg. Mitch is a docent at Holocaust Museum LA, and today he will talk about his father, who was a Holocaust survivor, and he'll tell the amazing story of how he discovered family photographs in the Auschwitz Album, which contains the only known photos ever taken inside of Auschwitz. Mitch will answer audience questions at the end of his presentation. So if you have a question, please click on Q&A and type your question there. Mitch, thank you so much for being with us today to share your fascinating story.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jill, and thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your busy days to come on and listen to me and hear my story. Let me tell you a little bit about how it's going to go so that you can prepare ahead. I'm going to speak for approximately 15 minutes on my dad's Holocaust story to give you background on what happened to him during the time of the Holocaust. And then I'll spend another 15 minutes talking about the discovery of the photographs in the Auschwitz album. At that point, I'll be showing some slides. So I'll be on screen first for about half of it. Don't look for any slides then, but they'll start coming on in about 15 minutes. So to get through and talk about my dad, he was born in December of 1927 in a small shtetl called Tache, which was in Czechoslovakia when he was born. Sometime around 1939, things were happening with the Nazis and land situations. And the part of Czechoslovakia that he grew up in was given over to Hungary, I think because they were cooperating well with the Nazis at that point. So actually, by 1939, he became considered what was a Hungarian Jew, so that when they were transported to Auschwitz, he was considered part of the Hungarian transports. As I said, he grew up in a small town near the Carpathian Mountains. Approximately 5,000 people in the shtetl, approximately half of them Jewish. And he always told me there were good relations between the Jews and the non-Jews. Everybody got along very well there. But by 1939, when the Hungarians came in, things changed. They cooperated with the Nazis. They put into effect many of the laws, many of the same Nuremberg laws, in fact, where they started having to wear Jewish stars on their clothing and became restricted in terms of business, where they were able to go, schools at some point. My dad and his brothers and sisters weren't allowed to go to the Hungarian schools anymore. But they had very busy days there. They went to regular school, they went to Hebrew school, they played with their friends. Soccer was a popular sport. They mixed in, like I said, with the non-Jewish inhabitants of the city. In my father's family, his father's name was Chaim Elia, and he was a shoemaker in the town of Tache. His mother, Chaya, was a seamstress. He had an older brother named Sam. Now, Sam did survive the war. He was not with the family, though, when they went into the ghetto and went to Auschwitz, because he was taken out by the Hungarians to be part of their slave labor force. So he had a completely different experience and didn't meet up with the survivors of the family till the end of the war. Then he had another brother named Yitzhak, who was also older. My dad was third. And then there were twins, a couple of years younger, my Uncle Joe, who also survived the war, and he is still alive today at 90 years old. And he had a twin sister named Suri, who sadly did not survive. By the way, for reference, my dad passed away approximately 4 years ago. And a lot of the reason that I do this and a lot that I like to speak about his experience and pass it on to future generations is because he did it, especially after we found the Auschwitz Album. He became very much wanting to pass the story on and talk about it. And I used to go with him and drive him places and assist him. And I really feel like it's sort of my mission to want to take it over, carry the baton, so to speak, and make sure that the story, goes on forever. Well, in 1944, around Passover time, which was April in 1944, the Jewish families were told that they had to leave Tache. They had to pack up a suitcase with their best belongings, and they were going to leave when Passover was over. When Passover ended, they were indeed rounded up and taken to a ghetto, also in the town of Tache. It was a small ghetto, but it was a ghetto nonetheless. And my dad and his family, minus Sam, who I told you was in the slave labor force, they all lived in a barn for a few weeks, and they shared that barn with another family. About approximately 6 weeks later, on May 28th, 1944, the Nazis came in, actually in collaboration with the Hungarians. They liquidated the ghetto and they put all of the inhabitants of the ghetto onto train cars. They didn't know where they were headed. Of course, they were ultimately headed to Auschwitz. They were on the trains for well over 24 hours, packed in, crammed in with their suitcases, no food, no water. Bathroom facility was a bowl that was placed in the corner of the train car. And the only time the train stopped was at the Hungarian border, so that the Hungarians themselves could come on and try to rob and loot the Jewish people as much as they could. Then they got to Auschwitz. When they came off the trains at Auschwitz, they, of course, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the selection process that went on. My father and his older brother Yitzhak and his younger brother Joe and their father, they were sent off to the side where they could become able to work in the camp and enroll into the camp. Unfortunately, my father's mother, my grandmother, was sent to the way of the gas chamber. My father's younger sister was going to be allowed to go into the work and be processed into the camp. However, she decided that she did not want to leave her mother. So sadly, she went with her mother, and they were murdered by the Nazis and gassed at Auschwitz. Well, after a couple of days at Birkenau, on May 30th, 2 days later, he was processed into the main camp at Auschwitz. He received a tattoo, which was number A10193. During his time at Auschwitz and with the Nazis, that was his identification. His name wasn't Mike to them. It was A10193 for all purposes. They, his first job, or actually the job that he got at Auschwitz was a pretty good one. He was happy about it because he was a garbage collector and a garbage sorter with his younger brother, Joe. So they'd get up in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, they'd have the awful breakfast that they gave him, if you could call it a breakfast. They'd get on a truck, drive into the town of Auschwitz, collect trash, and then they would take it to be sorted. Why was he lucky? He felt he was lucky because he was able to actually go through the trash and hopefully find food that he could eat. If somebody had thrown away, half a piece of chicken, or he found a piece of bread, or whatever he may have found, it was a lot better than what he was getting at Auschwitz. So he was able to eat those food items and try to stay a little bit stronger, and also smuggle some food back to save for later, or maybe to share with his father, who was back at the camp. In terms of his father, Chaim Elia, as I'm sure most of you know, the Nazis held selections on various occasions, and they would line them up in the morning and they would look them over and determine who, it didn't happen every day, but when they had a selection, they would determine who they thought was fit to continue working and who they decided that they could dispose of. Well, around the time of the high holidays, I think it was Sukkot, which is coming up very soon, in 1944, they selected out my dad's father, my grandfather, is no longer able to work, and they took him away, and he was murdered as well at Auschwitz, the gas chambers. My dad was able to continue working through the rest of the year 1944. As I said, I mentioned that the food was fairly awful. Over the course of a couple of meals, they'd get perhaps that daily piece of bread that you've probably heard about, maybe a little bit of soup. And my dad used to tell me if you could even call it or consider it soup. It was basically just thin water, and he said he was lucky if he found a piece of carrot in his soup for the day. And in the morning, that was probably in the evening. In the morning, maybe they'd get a little piece of cheese or a little piece of salami and coffee to be able to go on and do his work. When January 1945 rolled around, and of course the Russian army was advancing from the east and the other forces from the west, the Nazis knew that they had to evacuate the camp, so that's what they did. And they took the Jewish prisoners on what are known now as death marches. Ironically, some of the prisoners that remained at the camp, they did not kill them. They left them if they were too sick or ill for the walk, and the Russians came and liberated the camp and found those prisoners. But my father was taken on the death march. They marched approximately 40 miles from the camp back into Germany to a town called Gleiwitz, where they could get on a train station. If the prisoners were sick, if they couldn't walk, if they had to sit down or take a rest, most often they were shot by the Nazi guards that were there. The only time they rested on this march was when the Nazis themselves needed to rest. Once they got to Gleiwitz, they put them on trains, cars, again, and these were open box cars, open cattle cars, and it was very cold. It was January, it was snowing. The box cars were jam-packed, again, no food, no water. Bathroom facility, like I said, a bowl in the corner, but my dad said nobody really had a need to go to the bathroom because they were used bathroom facilities because they were so emaciated. That was a slow train, took almost a week to get back into Germany. My dad estimated that he weighed approximately 50 to 60 pounds at that time. When they got to the camp, which was Dora and Nordhausen, two camps that are right next to each other, they got off the trains, and my dad recalls going down to a river that was there, get something to drink. He was sick when he came back. Actually, he lied down in the snow and he couldn't get up. And my Uncle Joe, who was with him for this journey, he's told us subsequently that he never thought he was going to see my father again because of the condition that he was in. But he had to march on to the Dora concentration camp, which that camp's actually famous for its underground munitions, where the Nazis were working on building bombs and atom bombs and that sort of thing. So my dad was left behind lying in the snow. This is one of the first miracles, I would say, he would tell you, that happened to him. But an SS officer came up to him and he asked him what his name was. And my dad said, Kreitenberg. For some reason, unbeknownst to my dad, he's never been able to figure it out, but this Nazi officer actually took him to shelter, which was basically a bombed out bunker, but actually took him back to shelter, gave him something to eat, and really saved his life. I've learned it during my time at the museum. There's a theory that many of the Nazis at the end of the war, when they realized they were losing and that maybe they were going to go meet their maker in heaven one day, that they perhaps ought to do a good deed and maybe save a life. Maybe that had something to do with it. We don't know. But my father always considered this to be his personal Messiah. After Dora, he was transferred to Nordhausen, which was right next door, and he was eventually liberated by the American forces. Very fortunately, because he was so emaciated, couldn't eat, they started feeding him on oatmeal as they would a child, to try to build up his stomach and build up his strength again. So they were very good about that. Once he regained his strength, all the Jewish survivors, they pretty much made a pact and said, go home. Everybody go home to see who survived. So another great story. My father was on his way back home, back to Tache. He was in Budapest in a Red Cross facility, sitting on a couch in a waiting room, and his younger brother Joe walked into the room. That's actually how they reunited. The two of them continued on to Tache, where they discovered that their older brother Sam had also survived the war. So the three of them were the ones that survived from the family. There were also three aunts that survived. My father's mother's three sisters also survived the war. While they lived in Tache, with the Russians in control, the Russians weren't very nice to them. They put them to work. They really gave them heavy-duty labor. The Jewish people also found out, the word went around, that the Russians were going to close the border and close basically what became the Iron Curtain. So once they found out and they were told to get out, they left the next day. And they went back into Germany and lived in a couple of different locations in Germany after the war. By 1947, a couple of years after the war, my father learned that there was a program to send orphans to the United States, but you had to be 18 years old or younger to qualify. So my father falsified his age. Nobody had any paperwork at that time. He was already 19, but he changed his date of birth from 1927 to 1928 so that he'd be able to qualify for this program. So he and Joe were able to go on the program, take a ship to New York. All of my dad's official documents, all his life, from his passport to his driver's license, always showed that 1928 date, but we knew that he was really born in 1927. Actually, I have to clarify that. When he was 50, or when we thought he was 50, in 1978, my family decided to make a birthday party for him. And he informed us at that time, hey, I've got to tell you guys, I was actually 50 last year. What are you talking about? Then he told us the story about how he had to change his birth date by a year, kept that to himself all that time. Even my mother didn't know that story. Well, he made it out to Los Angeles because he had a cousin living out here, lived in Boyle Heights. He was able to live a good life and had, I think, a great family. He and both of his brothers, the three of them that came out to Los Angeles, each had 3 sons. So the next generation, there were 9 of us male Kreitenberg cousins. And I'm very proud to say today that from my father and his 2 brothers, the 3 of them, there are now 75 more descendants just from the 3 of them through the next 3 generations. So 75 new Kreitenberg descendants, all born in the United States. Proud of my granddaughter Maya, who was born in December. She became number 75 just last December. So that's, in a nutshell, his Holocaust story. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about another amazing discovery, which occurred in 1982. That's actually a photograph of my father and I approximately 15 years ago. Well, my father never talked much about the Holocaust. We knew about it. We obviously saw the tattoo on his arm, which happened to be a fairly faint one. And by the way, he was proud of that. So he never wanted to have it removed. I know it's a personal preference among the survivors. Some had it removed. Many did not want to have it removed. My dad never wanted to have his removed. But he didn't talk a lot about his experiences growing up. My mother was American born, so we didn't grow up with it in the house all the time. But we knew some of the basics until the amazing discovery of the Auschwitz Album. These are a couple of photographs of my dad and what he looked like when he came out. This is perhaps, let's see, let me find my pointer. This is perhaps the earliest photograph that I know of, 1947. Here he is with Joe, probably also 1947. This one's my dad, and that's his younger brother, Joe. And this is my father because wasn't enough to go through the Holocaust. The United States Army drafted him, and he served the U.S. Army during the time of the Korean War. A little bit more current pictures. These are the four brothers, my father, Joe, Sam, the eldest. This is Yitzhak. I think I neglected to mention to you, when he first came into the camp, the Nazis asked for volunteers, for people who were familiar with blacksmith work, working with metals and fire. He was a stubborn kid. He volunteered to go do that with his friend. My dad always assumed that it was probably perhaps gas chamber, crematorium work, but they never saw him again. This photograph, years later, was given to my father and his brothers by a friend who had a photograph of him. So this was edited into the photograph of the four of them. And this is Sam, my dad, Mike, and Joe. I think that's at a family bar mitzvah, probably in somewhere in the 1970s. So, in June of 1982, I was home one day on a Saturday afternoon, and I was looking through the LA Times newspaper, and I found a very interesting article, the one that's up on the screen. And I was reading it, and I read the story of a woman named Lily Meir. What happened was, a lot of her story happened very similar to my dad's. She was at Auschwitz. She was part of the Hungarian deportations. She was from a town that was very, very close to where my dad lived. By the way, Elie Wiesel's town of Siget was about 30 minutes away from Tache, where my father was from. Lily Meir was also from a town in that area, was deported at the same time, taken to Auschwitz at the same time, death march at the same time, went to Dora. All very similar. It's all described in the article. But what happened was, when she was at Dora and the camp was liberated, she was put into what was formerly Nazi officers' barrack, where they told her to rest, get some sleep. She opened up a drawer, looked for a blanket, and she found a photo album. And it was literally a photo album. It was bound together with pages of photographs, and there were actually even chapters. Arrival of the Jews at Auschwitz, selection of the Jews at Auschwitz, able-bodied men, able-bodied women, personal effects, clothing. It was basically almost like done to be a day in the life of a Jew, following this group of Jews for 2 days through their admission into the camp. Well, it turned out it was a photograph of a Hungarian transport of Jews. Lily Meir looked through the photographs, and to her, I don't even know what adjective to use, her amazement, her horror, unbelievably, she found a photograph of herself and her entire family. It was the day that her family was taken to Auschwitz and taken off the trains. She also found photographs of her entire town. Everybody that was involved in taken over to Auschwitz, she saw them. Well, I told my father about this, and I want to mention actually also that she found the book again at Dora, and she held on to the book for many, many, many years. She allowed the Jewish Museum in Prague to take some photographs, but until approximately 1980, she actually kept the album to herself. Finally, gave it to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, Israel, in 1982, and they published this book, the Auschwitz Album. So I told my dad about the article that I had read, and asked him if we should go pick up the book. And he said, no, I'm not interested. Come on, I don't want to look at things like that. Well, a few minutes later, he relented. I went out, I picked up the book, brought it home. I went off to go do what I was doing. He starts leafing through the pages of the book and calls me in where I was from the other part of the house. It was Mitch. I'm amazed by this, but I think this is my brother, where I wrote Uncle Yitzhak with an arrow. And of course, He hadn't seen him since 1944. The only photograph that existed was the one in that four-way photograph. And he was really visibly shaken. I told him to relax. My mom was home too. Take it easy, Dad. I left him with a book. Comes back a few minutes later, and he's got a magnifying glass. Now he's really onto this picture. Shows me this one here, the man with the cap. Says to me, Mitch, who does that look like? And I said, that looks like Uncle Sam. Remember, that's my dad's eldest brother who was in the Hungarian slave labor that survived the war. And of course, Sam was not at Auschwitz. But my dad told me Sam grew up to look like his father. So that this indeed was his father. It's the only known photograph that we have of my grandfather. A few minutes later, go by with the magnifying glass. He finds this photo between the men in the two hats, and basically that's my dad. He found himself. You can actually tell he's standing shoulder to shoulder with his older brother, and he's in the same line as his father. Not sure maybe who was in that spot. So he found a photo of himself. Many of you listening to this today have seen my dad, or you see pictures of him. It's very obvious, I think, to anybody who knows him that was him. That's him. There's also this head right here standing in front of my grandfather, and that is a photograph of Joe, who was also in line that day. So just an incredible, amazing discovery. My dad had goosebumps on his arm like I've never seen on a human being before. It was really, really incredible and shocking, and every adjective that you could use. And really simply miraculous to find these photographs in 1982 that had been taken in 1944. And when you really look at the odds of the whole situation, these photographs in the Auschwitz album are the only known photographs ever taken from inside of Auschwitz. There are 3 others that were taken in a different circumstance, but these are the only photographs otherwise ever taken from inside of Auschwitz. And who would think that a Nazi officer would be commissioned to come in 1944 and do it on the exact day? I mean, trains came in around the clock for years. It's believed 1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz. Trains all the time. That they would take photographs on that day of that train that my dad was on and catch the entire family in photographs. Really just like a miracle from above. Unbelievable. Here's a close-up of my dad, same photograph. Then there's this photograph. This photograph, perhaps because the children that are in the photograph, it's really an iconic photograph. It's everywhere. This photograph was already on the walls of the Holocaust Museum, LA, when I arrived there to visit. It later became a docent, as we know. It's on the museum wall at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel. It's also blown up life-size in Block 4 at the camp at Auschwitz. The first few bunks at Auschwitz are where the museum is today. My dad lived in Block 6. I meant to say block before. Block 6, how ironic, blow up of his mother and sister, Suri, in Block 4 at Auschwitz that all visitors, come to see and visit. And these are the only known photographs also, just like my grandfather, these are the only known photographs of my grandmother Haya and my aunt Suri. Never saw photographs of them until we found this in 1982. Well, my father and his brothers were able to identify their entire town, just like Lily May here. Most of the doctor, the rabbis, the lawyers, all of the people that worked in the town, They were all identified. My father and his brothers made approximately 100 identifications of people from the town of Tache and gave it to Yad Vashem. So what happened was, over the course of time, I discovered approximately a couple of years ago, through another Yad Vashem publication, that they weren't getting some of the names right. So I found out that they built a new museum. Perhaps they lost what they had or misplaced things, but they didn't have the documentation that my father had given them. So I contacted them about that. I went out to Yad Vashem and had a meeting there in July of last summer. Actually, I was there on July 4th. My son Ben happened to be there after graduating from UCLA, and my brother Ernie was there with his family. So three of us went in, gave them all the identifications, gave them all the information. That's a photo of us at Yad Vashem, and right here is the photo on the wall of my mother's family. And I do want to say also that particular photograph, it's everywhere. It's on book covers. It's in it's on documentaries. I've seen it 3 times on 60-minute documentaries pertaining to the Holocaust. I always seem drawn to that picture, maybe, like I was saying, because of the kids involved in the photograph. I don't know, but it's a very, like I said, iconic photograph. At Holocaust Museum in LA, they were terrific. That photograph was already in the museum. And what they did for me last year was, for everybody, they inset a photograph of my dad's picture into that one. So really happy about that. Well, after we finished the meeting and the presentation at Yad Vashem, they told the 3 of us that they had a surprise for us. Surprise. What could they do for me that would be a surprise? Well, they took the 3 of us down an elevator, down way into the basement of Yad Vashem. They took us through 2 or 3 key-coded doors. They took us into a room which was very cold. It had to be in the 30s. And then a man came in with a box, wearing white gloves. He opened up the box, and inside the box was the original Auschwitz album, one that was found by Lily Meir at Dora in 1944. There is a facsimile album up in the museum at Yad Vashem. Most of the docents there will tell you it's the real book. I always thought it was, but it's not. The real one is kept hidden away. They told us they bypassed a lot of protocols for my Ben and Ernie and I to be able to see that album. They said it's basically reserved for historians and dignitaries, and it doesn't come out at all very often. So for me, it was really, truly a lifetime experience to get to see that book. I never dreamed that I'd be able to do that. This is actually what the album looked like. Just to give you a sense, it was 4 little photographs with white borders and wax paper in between. Like I said, there were neat titles in between. This is the photograph of my grandmother and aunt. And this is looking down at the original page. Again, my aunt and grandmother in the corner of that photograph. And this is the original photograph from the Auschwitz album of my dad. You might wonder why I entitled this presentation, Finding a Needle in a Haystack. It's because going back to that day in 1982, I actually said to my dad, wow, this is unbelievable. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. And he came back and told me, no, actually to him, it's like finding a needle in the whole world. Just seemed such an impossible gift, but such a fantastic, remarkable family find. And with that, I conclude my part of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and I'm happy to take any questions on any topics for clarification. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitch. It's just a fascinating story. It's not even the first time I've heard it, and it still gives me chills to hear it. We have a few questions from the audience, and I'd encourage everyone to, if you have other questions, just click on the Q&A icon and type your questions there, and we'll try to get to them. So first, someone asked about the town that your father's from, Tache. They're asking, where exactly is it, and what other names does it have in other languages like German or Hungarian?
That's a great question. Like most of the towns in that area, they have multiple names. They have Czech names, they have Hungarian names, they have Russian names, they even have German names. My father knew it as Tache. Long name for it was Tache, probably a Czech name. What happened after the war was it went back to Russia, and today it sits in the Ukraine, the very far western edge of the Ukraine. If you look at, like I said, Elie Wiesel was from Siget. If you find Siget and Hust on a map, those are two fairly large cities in the western Ukraine. You draw a straight line, Tache is virtually in the middle of it. However, today on most maps on the Ukrainian name, it's called, I don't know how they pronounce it even, Tesco, or it's T-E-C-S-O, which I think in their pronunciation is also Tache. But if you were to find, that makes it difficult for me too, because when I do research and I look for information on it, it falls under Tesco. I also want to add that back in 1991, my two brothers and I and my dad, the four of us, did take a trip back to Tache, and we also visited Auschwitz. And it was interesting because, I know I'm digressing a bit, but it's a good story. My dad wanted to go to Tache. He always wanted to go back to Tache. He remembered it as being green and lush, and the Tisza River runs through it. It's right at the base of the Carpathian Mountains. It's beautiful. He did not want to go to Auschwitz at all. We had to convince him, work him to do that. Ironically, when we did go on the trip, he was saddened by Tache because when he left, he was about 16 years old, and it wasn't what he remembered. It had lived through the Iron Curtain. It was gray. It was dark. It almost really saddened his memory of what he saw. Yet at Auschwitz, where he didn't want to go, it was the exact opposite. He walked around like he owned the place. We videotape recorded him. He walked us around the camp, showed us everything. By the way, I want to mention my dad also did a Shoah Foundation tape through the Spielberg effort. And if anybody ever wants to take a look at that, that's available, you know, if you visit the museum or some other sources. So.
Thank you. So a few questions about the actual album. One question is asked by Ted Lux, whom I think you know, and he wants to know,
hi, Ted.
Do we know who took the photos and put the album together?
Very interesting. There is a full documentary on that, which the History Channel shows on occasion, where they discuss this. There was an officer who was transferred to the camp maybe the week before. I believe, from memory, his last name was Hoffman. People believe that he took the photographs, but if you actually read the pretext in the album itself, it's not known with certainty. Nobody really knows, but research seems to believe it was this one officer who came in and had a camera, because he also took some other photographs of Nazis on an off day out picnicking at a park, which this documentary also covers. I think it's a great documentary. So they believe it was him, but we'll never really know with certainty.
And what do we know, if anything, about why the photographer took the photos? Was it, officially sanctioned by the Nazis, or was it something that someone just did on his own? Do we know?
It would have to have been officially sanctioned by the Nazis. These questions are great. I mean, they've been researched by people, so I'm just basically relaying what I've read and learned. It would have to have been done with the approval of the Nazis. There's no question. Nobody could walk in there with a camera. They suspect that it was just perhaps for their documentation purposes that they decided to, like I said, shoot a life in the day of a Jew, perhaps, about what happened to the extinct Jewish race and how they were processed through the camp. There's really no other explanation other than that, as far as I or any other historians that I've read. I don't know.
And so you said Lily Mayer found this album at the Dora camp,
Yes.
correct? So shortly after the end of the war?
Yes, it was immediately after the war. It was when liberation came, because I think it was the Americans that came in there, and they told her to go into, like I said, what was formerly a Nazi officer's barrack. Go in there. It was the nicest room, nicest rooms on the camp, so that she could go in and take a rest. And as I said, she opened the door, a drawer, to look for a blanket because she was cold, and she found the photographs. And she really treated it like a private heirloom. I mean, a lot of historians are not happy that she actually kept the book until 1982. In fact, 3 of the pictures she took out and gave to friends because there were friends who survived. And I think they eventually may have gotten at least 1 or 2 of those back. But yeah, that's basically what happens. I think she found it perhaps the day of liberation.
And do we know what motivated her to eventually hand it over to a museum?
Well, she did give copies of the photographs to the museum, Jewish Museum in Prague, which I believe is the largest Jewish museum in Europe. And people knew the photographs were out there. And I think it was a matter of, and I'm not sure what year, I don't recall what year. Fairly early on, I think she gave them copies of the photographs, and that's where they were housed. But then, of course, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem made an effort to contact her and reach out to her. I don't know the process of how long it took, excuse me, but I think it did take some time where they finally, convinced her it was the proper thing to do.
So you mentioned that your father didn't talk much about his experiences during the Holocaust when you were young, but finding this album and seeing the pictures of his family opened the door for him to talk about it?
Yes, growing up, I think I mentioned briefly, my mother was not a survivor. We didn't really grow up with it. We didn't have Yiddish spoken in the house. But we knew, we saw the tattoo on his arm, and we knew that he was at Auschwitz, and we knew that he grew up in Tache. He liked to talk about that a lot more, about his childhood in Tache and fun things that he did, with his brothers and his family. But once we found the Auschwitz album, it really opened the floodgates. Then all of a sudden, he became really proud of it. We traveled to Israel with him in 1984, I think it was, to make our first presentation of the discoveries. In fact, he was in Block 4, where the blow-up is of his family, and spoke to Israeli high schools that were on vacation coming through. I mean, they treated him like he was something really incredible. It was amazing. We videotaped the whole experience. But from that point on, he became interested in speaking to mostly school groups, I'd say, especially my kids' middle schools, high schools, other groups that we found out about. And all of a sudden, then he was an open book and really happy to tell his experience. And I became interested in it. And when he'd go to a school, I'd go with him. And oftentimes I'd videotape him. And as he got a little bit older and it became more difficult for him to tell his story, then I would pretty much chime in up to towards the end, where he would basically come with me and I would tell a story, and he would show his tattoo on his arm to the kids, which kids always find most fascinating. And of course, then he was no longer able to do it. He passed away 4 years ago, and I decided that I wanted to, take it on and make sure that the story lives on.
And we're glad you do that, and especially we're thrilled that we can have you tell the story in the museum, where, as you said, we've had one of your family's photos on the wall, and I encourage everyone, when the museum opens again, to come see that and to see the photo we added of your family.
Both of the photos are up now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's terrific. I suggest all of you, please come take a virtual tour of the museum. It's terrific. The people there are really, really terrific. And of course, when it opens up, just contact me or contact someone at the museum if you'd like to come down. I really think it's a terrific place.
Yeah, Mitch is one of our large and amazing group of volunteer docents who give tours in person, and many are now giving online virtual tours. So we have a lot of comments and questions, including from some of your friends and family. I want to read this comment from David Langa, who's a survivor in our community. He says,
Right.
Mitch, thank you for your dedication to carry forward your Holocaust story as a second-generation survivor. I had the privilege to be with you at the March of the Living at Auschwitz and was awed by your discovery of your father's suffering.
Hi, David, and thank you, David, for telling your story. Many of you probably don't know, but David is a Holocaust survivor as well. He also has incredible stories and tells them in an incredible way. I'm a believer also, by the way, that I think all the survivor stories are amazing. They're all amazing in their own way. They're all incredible. It's just this finding of the Auschwitz album, for me personally, puts it over the top. What happened in 1982 just put the whole thing over the top. Thank you, David.
And finding pictures of your grandparents who you had never seen before.
Exactly.
Has to be just a life-changing experience. I mean, so many survivors don't even have surviving pictures of their parents.
We never had them until 1982. Never knew what they looked like. And my my aunt Suri, by the way, she was a twin of Joe. We're actually fortunate the Nazis never found out that they were twins. But my daughter Shira is a name for Suri, and she wears that very proudly.
So you mentioned a documentary, and someone asked about the documentary called Nazi Scrapbooks from Hell. Is that the one you're referring to?
That's it, exactly.
Okay.
Half of it is about the Auschwitz album, and half of it is from some other photographs, like I said, of Nazis at play, I guess you could say. They would refer to them as monsters at play. But yeah, that's what I'm talking about, scrapbooks from hell. And they really were from hell.
Ruben Schwartz says, I remember you coming to Vienna to see my grandmother with the album. I just told my kids.
Great. Thank you, Ruben. We have viewers from Vienna, that means. And Israel. That's terrific. Thank you.
Wonderful. Someone is asking how you feel, sorry, I'm trying to find the exact question. How you feel when you hear about people denying the Holocaust. What's your response? Have you ever been confronted by someone who denied or questioned?
All these questions are so good. They're right on point.
No.
I was actually, I'm going to say maybe 5 years ago, for people who know the Valley in LA, I was in Kinko's office near Ventura and Topanga Boulevards, and I was making some photographs into blow-ups to use for a school presentation. And a little old man was pushing a basket. He looked like almost one step above the homeless. He came up to me to look at what I was looking at, and he says, "What are those photographs?" And I said, "Photographs from the Holocaust." He said, "Did those people die in the Holocaust?" I said, "Many of them did." And he said, "Oh, I really hardly believe that." I was just like taken back, and what? Then it turned out that all the garbage that he had in his big market basket was denial literature. And he started handing me stuff, asking me to read it. And I said, "I don't need this stuff. I don't need to read this." Interestingly, there was an Israeli man in there who was previously looking at the photographs with me. And while I was stunned and flabbergasted, this man went off on him, started yelling at him, basically chased him out of the store. So that's really the only time it happened. It's horrifying, but that's why I try my best to tell the story. I think it's great at the museum that 40,000 kids come through a year, whatever it is, so that we can get to them early and explain the things that happen and be able to use the photographs, for example. I mean, I have documentation from the Hungarian government and also from a book called The Chronicle of Auschwitz, showing that the Tache ghetto was liquidated. There's dates of when all the trains were sent, and it was in March 28th. And then entry into the camp, they show the numbers of the prisoners that came in, which includes A10193, that gap. So I myself try to put together as much evidentiary information as I can. There's almost no talking to those people, so I don't really know what can be done other than educate and teach, and try to do it at a young age when it really matters. And that's really why I'm so in love with the purpose and mission of Holocaust Museum LA.
Thank you. On a different topic, someone is asking when your family returned home to Tache. Did they find their home? Did they find their belongings, or was everything taken?
Great questions today. When we went back in 1991, we knew that there was one Jewish family that had remained in Tache. And the man that lived there was my dad's best friend growing up. My Uncle Sam had been there previously. We knew he was there. We knew that we were going to contact him. So we did make it to Tache, and we walked on the same streets that they lived on. I mean, you got to understand, this was a shtetl. There was no running water. They used outhouses, and there still were outhouses there in 1991. They had no electricity. They used candlelight. My father's exact house wasn't there, but many others were. And it still looked pretty shtetl-ish in 1991. I mean, there were horse-drawn buggies coming down the street, handful of cars. What was interesting, though, we found the synagogue. The synagogue was still in existence, and very distinctive look. It's still there. It was a gymnasium when they were there in 1991. We were able to get in, and there was gym equipment everywhere. But, to have my dad walk us to the far right side of the room, it wasn't huge. It wasn't a huge room, and say, "Hey, this is where my family seats were. This is where we sat for services." When he was a kid. We also went to the cemetery. His friend. That Jewish society, they still run the cemetery there. And that was really amazing as well. We couldn't find any of our family's markers there. It wasn't marked very well. We weren't prepared in advance. Hopefully, if I go back one day, we can learn more. But it was amazing because when we were done, he said, "Oh, and over there on that side is the 200-year-old section. And then back there is the 300-year-old section." Thinking, wow, this is just incredible history. To think it was, older than the formation of the United States, for example. It was really, really incredible history. And we also did meet many families that remembered the Kreitenberg name and remembered my grandparents. There was one woman, I was hoping she wasn't going to pass out, a really elderly, white-haired old lady who was like, oh my God. She's like hyperventilating in her language. She couldn't believe that here was a Kreitenberg, coming back because she, knew the parents. And she wasn't Jewish. Of course, those families were not Jewish.
Amazing that you were able to return and meet people who remembered your family.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Good question.
We are about out of time. I'm going to say thank you again so much to Mitch for putting together this presentation and sharing it with us today and sharing it with visitors to the museum. We really appreciate it. I didn't read all the comments, but so many people thanking you for sharing your story and for carrying on your father's memory.
Thank you so much. I hope to see the comments later, but thank all of you, like I said, for giving up your valuable time to listen to our story.
So before we sign off, I want to invite everyone to join us at one of our upcoming programs. Tomorrow, Thursday, September 10th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, we will host a talk by Holocaust survivor Harry Davids. And on Sunday, September 13th at noon Pacific time, please join us for a special performance by the Krakow Duo, streamed live from the Center for Jewish Culture in Krakow's historic Jewish quarter. You can find information about all of our upcoming virtual events on our website. Our new website is holocaustmuseumla.org. The museum provides these online programs at no charge. If you are enjoying our programs, we invite you to please consider supporting our work by going to holocaustmuseumla.org and making a donation. Thank you again to Mitch and to everyone for joining us today. Take care, and we hope to see you again very soon.